welcome to Contact. I'm Gloria Crichton, and we're here once again at the beautiful Ferguson Point Tea House in Stanley Park. My guest on today's show is well-known writer and poet, currently with the Vancouver Sun, Mr. Stephen Hume. Stephen, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here.
Did I get your name right?
You got it right.
And I should say, welcome back to BC.
Glad to be home.
You've been asked to come out here by the Vancouver Sun, and you've had an illustrious career with the Edmonton Journal for many years.
That's correct.
You
yes.
left, what should I say, an exciting or important job as general manager with the Journal to come back and write for the Sun. Is that a good move for you? Or?
Well, it's a great move for me. I mean, I feel tremendously liberated by the whole process of returning to writing after so many years of management. These things come in full circles, you know. You come into this business to be, in the beginning, to write. You want to write. And then you find that you gradually get sidetracked into other sorts of things, and I think you really never lose the desire. See, certainly I never lost the desire to return to writing, and this was a great opportunity to do it in the province that's my home, and the chance to come back here and write about people and life in BC was a great opportunity.
Well, we're certainly pleased to have you with Vancouver Sun and in BC.
Well, I'm pleased to be here.
And I'm sure people in Edmonton are missing you.
Maybe not.
As general manager, were you involved with writers or the creative process of writing, or doing any writing as you are now, or was it?
Well, no. In a general manager's role, you're really essentially divorced from the creative part of the paper, the creative process in the paper to some extent. You're much more involved in the day-to-day operating functions of the business side of the newspaper, negotiating newsprint contracts and making sure that your inventories are right, and worrying about forms for your billing procedures and
really?
barcode readers in the warehouse and that sort of thing. It's stimulating and it's exciting work, but to me it wasn't the same as writing for an audience. I wanted to get back to writing for an audience.
I imagine it must have been difficult in a sense, because you're a very creative person and you miss being out in the field, I imagine. Well,
I like to say, I said to my boss in Edmonton when I told him I wanted to go, that I felt like my hands had been amputated. And I've gotten them back again.
Super. Tell me a little bit about your column, Stephen. What are you trying to do with this column?
Well, I think what I'm trying to do is, on the one hand, of course, trying to get readers for the Sun.
Right.
At another level, I'm trying to open some doors and try and see if I can make some connections between events and circumstances in the lives of ordinary people in this province, both with the history of the province and, of course, out of that history, some sense of where the province might be going in the future. I think that the role of a newspaper like the Sun is to provide a forum for those kinds of discussions, debates about ideas, raising questions of moral purpose in the society itself. What kind of province do we want to leave for our children in the next century? What kind of province do we think we have the right to impose upon coming generations? Where do we think we've come from? Because you have to know where you've come from if you're going to know where you're going.
Do you see yourself as an educator in this respect?
Well, I think every writer sees himself or herself as an educator in that respect. I think we all feel that we have something to say, and we all feel that some of the things that we say will be of benefit to other people. So I think, yes, you think of yourself as an educator in that sense, but not in a didactic sense, not in the sense of wanting to impose my views on any reader. I mean, I'm there to offer alternative points of view. That's the wonderful thing about working for a big metropolitan newspaper, particularly one like the Sun with its tradition of dissent and dispute. It's a very rambunctious kind of place to work. There's a great deal of argy-bargy and trading of ideas and debate about issues, and that's what newspapers should be. It should be a hurly-burly, not a kind of a bland, homogenized view of what society is about. Yes, newspapers like ours have a responsibility for playing back to the community some sense of what the community is, and to try and do that as objectively as possible. But we also have an obligation to try and set agendas for the community, agendas for discussion, agendas for debate, because the newspaper, in a way, is the last available. I like to think of it as a kind of town hall meeting place. It's the last chance that our society has for everybody in the community to get together and argue about where we think we should go.
Do you, how about freedom with your column, say, versus editors? And I know you've been an editor-in-chief, city editor yourself. Do you have conflicts at times with the editor of the paper, or how much freedom do you have to get out and say what you want to say?
I've never had a conflict with an editor here. I've been given a great deal of freedom, and with that freedom, of course, comes responsibility. A responsibility to write in good taste and to try and be accurate as possible. None of which is to deprive you of the right to express an opinion. And I have never had my opinions questioned by anybody at the Sun. I've been very free, and I feel wonderful about that.
Great. In this connection, talking about moral responsibility, do you, with yourself, sometimes have questions or solutions or problems that, you know, of portraying, say, a person that you might hurt, if you were to write particular thing about that person? How do you go about that?
I think every responsible writer grapples with those kinds of questions all the time. I think you have to ask yourself whenever you're doing anything, who might be hurt by this? And then you have to go one step further and say, well, if somebody might be hurt by this, what are the merits of that versus the merits, say, of the greater public good, the need, the right of people to be informed? Sometimes, because of the way we have conflicts and manage conflicts in our society, sometimes individuals find themselves in the way of the public commonwealth and can be hurt. There's no question about that. I always remember that politicians are human beings. They're the same as me. They, aside from the trappings of their office, they have all the same capabilities and capacities to be wounded that I have. So I worry about that. But politicians also, to some extent, like me, step into the public arena, and therefore the rules are somewhat different. You know, I tend to apply different rules in that sense to people in public office than I do to people who are private citizens. Private citizens have a right to privacy, I think. Sometimes their right to privacy is outweighed by the public's need to know, and then you have a conflict that can only be resolved by a decision that you yourself make. You know, Machiavelli once said that it's sometimes necessary in the national good for a prince to lie to his people, but the great princes always suffer for having lied to their people. What I'm getting at by that is that sometimes you have to do things that you find painful to do yourself, but sometimes they have to be done. The great question here is whether you feel remorse for having hurt somebody's feelings. Sometimes you weigh the odds and you say, well, the public interest is not served by writing this and hurting this person, then you don't write it.
Some difficult decisions, I imagine,
yes,
but they've got to be made. As we said earlier, you've sort of come full circle. Now, you, after years sort of in the administration end of the newspaper business, you've come back to writing, and I'd like to go back around that circle to your first job when you were lucky to have a job right upon graduation from university with the Edmonton Journal. What was your beat? What were you doing there? I
joined the Edmonton Journal in 1971 and was almost immediately posted to the Journal's Arctic Bureau, located in Yellowknife in the Northwest Territories. And my responsibility then was providing coverage of the Alaska, Yukon Territory, the Northwest Territories, and occasionally Greenland. And essentially that beat, I believe, is the largest in the world. That's the responsibility of any individual reporter. The Journal is the only newspaper that maintains a permanent bureau in Canada's north. And essentially what I did for 3 years was travel around a part of the world that 99.999% of Canadians will never see. It was a wonderful opportunity for me, and in some ways it changed my life. It changed it in the sense of creating a sense of the vastness of the country and how circumscribed so many of our attitudes are when we live in this little narrow strip along the southern border.
Do you have any memorable impressions of the North, the Arctic?
I always like to tell a story about a young fellow Peter Ernick, who is now... Peter Ernick is a very interesting man. He's exactly my age. He's 1 month younger than I am. And Peter was born in an igloo. Did not see his first white person until he was 16 years old. He subsequently went through high school, and between the ages of 16 and 22 or so, went through high school and university, and went on to become the Minister of Economic Development for the Northwest Territories government. Peter took me out one day to show me the sea ice in the high Arctic, and we traveled hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours, and we finally stopped, and we're out in the middle of this plain of snow, and Peter said to me, you know, the nearest tree is 1,800 miles south of here.
Isn't that incredible?
And I thought about what he was talking about, and then he said, you know, the northern frontier of Canada is another 1,100 miles north. The center of Canada, in fact, is not near Winnipeg or whatever. The center of Canada is Baker Lake. It's equidistant from all points of the country. If you look at Baker Lake on a map, it's right up in the middle of what they call the Keewatin district, the home of the north wind in the language of the native people there. It's a little village of about 200 people, or it was then. The population would be bigger now, I guess, but it's completely surrounded by what we would consider to be desolation, but to them was a rich, rich environment.
What an honor to have been there at that time.
Well, it was wonderful for me, and as I say, it put the whole nature of Canada into a series of different contexts for me, which have informed a lot of my own writing about the country since then.
Super. Tell me, in this connection, Stephen, is the ecosystem as fragile as they say it is in the Arctic?
The ecosystem is not only as fragile as they say it is in the Arctic, it's as fragile as the Arctic right here. When one thinks that in the eastern Arctic, in Baffin Island, today, mother's breast milk is considered toxic because of PCB contamination. When you find that the seals of Hudson Bay, of the west coast of Hudson Bay, are contaminated with mercury, the whales in the high Arctic are now turning out to be as contaminated with toxic chemicals as some of the creatures in the St. Lawrence Seaway. I think it's a cause for great concern. I'm very worried about where our increasing industrial growth is taking us. And the Brundtland Commission for the United Nations, I think, has spelled this out very, very clearly. I don't think it's a bandwagon sort of proposition now. I believe that we are at the brink of some environmental catastrophes if we are not very, very careful about where we go.
You're talking in general or just the Arctic now?
I'm talking in general. For Canada and for the world, in fact. One of the things about our culture is that it's so self-absorbed. It is so wrapped up in its own televised image of itself that until we have some sort of cataclysm that affects us, Canadians or Americans, we tend to think of all of these things as something that happens to somebody else of a different color on the other side of the planet. We're already starting to see some of the consequences of our profligate exploitation of resources and our industrial growth in places like Siberia, in places like Central Africa. Central African republics are suffering the same kinds of water degradation that we are suffering. The expansion of desert areas. All of these things, I think, ultimately, the price will be paid here. We think it can't happen to us.
It's happening.
It's happening, in fact.
In this connection, do you have any opinion on, a well-known writer recently said that environmentalists are sort of out to get the economy, or they're working against the economy? Do you have any impressions on that?
Well, my own view is that we live in a society in which policies are formed out of the testing of ideas, the clash of ideas and the clash of opinions. There are a whole range of different views of how our economy should develop and where it should go, and there are a lot of valid views about what we should be doing on both sides of the spectrum. I think that we need the dissidents, we need the radicals, we need the people that one set of extremists characterize as crazy. We need all of those people, as much as we need thoughtful people sitting on the boards of directors of major corporations. We need to listen to our writers and our poets and our environmentalists and our preservationists and our conservationists. All of those people have something to contribute to the debate. I think to silence them or to suggest that they shouldn't be listened to would be very dangerous for the whole prospect of democratic policy making in this country. It seems to me that we need to listen to everybody, and very often it's the people who sound the craziest who turn out to be right in the long run. I mean, if we go back 150 years and look at how doctors approached childbearing, for example, we had a huge epidemic of childbed fever in Europe because doctors did not understand that coming from the mortuary where they had been examining cadavers to the lying-in room to deliver infants was killing the mothers. There was quite a prominent European doctor who put forward the premise that doctors should actually wash their hands with disinfectant before they went to deliver babies. He was ridiculed and driven out of practice by people who said he was crazy. He turned out to be right, and we all turned out to be crazy. And that is why it's so important to always listen to voices that seem to come from the most extreme fringes. And that applies to voices that come from the corporate sector as well.
Looking at the Arctic, the oil industry has changed the way of life. It was a nomadic way of life at one time. Is this detrimental to their survival, or is the fact that they have cars and buses helping?
Well, I think that most of them don't have cars and buses. In fact, most people in the Arctic don't benefit directly from the oil industry. Yeah, there are some people who get jobs on rigs as roustabouts and whatnot. But I don't think that the oil industry has had a positive effect for people there. It's had a positive effect for people in southern Canada. It's generated a great deal of wealth for us. Whether it's of great benefit to people who would prefer to live on the land is another matter. Peter Ernick, the young fellow I was mentioning before, said to me a very interesting thing. He said, "You know, you guys think that we want to own the land with these land claims, but you're wrong. We can't own the land. The land owns us." We've lost sight of that in our own culture. And a consequence of that is our sense of disconnectedness from the environment, which is one of the reasons why we justify so many of the things that we do to the environment. And we do this at a personal level, at an individual level. This is, I mean, our pollution problems in Burrard Inlet are not solely the problems created by industry. Many of them are created by individuals who pour their bleach down the sink or pour the oil from their car into the storm sewer. So we have to begin taking responsibility for these things at individual levels as well as at organizational levels.
I'd like to get back to the Native situation for a moment, if I may. Recently we've had budget cuts that are impacting on Native peoples, and there is a Native tribe that has had a newspaper. Can you elaborate on this?
Oh, well, yes. I mean, the Native Communications Society of British Columbia publishes a weekly or bi-weekly newspaper called Katu, which is quite a small publication. It serves the 26 tribal groups in the province. I found their case very interesting, and I've written about it recently, because these people were organized in the early 1980s with the idea of providing a forum for discussion and information about what's going on in the Native community to all of these widely dispersed communities that did not have a kind of unified forum for discussion, much as the Vancouver Sun provides that kind of forum for the community of Vancouver. Their budget in 1983 was, I'm told by one of their directors, $240,000. Between 1983 and 1990, that budget did not increase by 1 penny. So these people lived within their means. They lived in a very responsible fashion with a great deal of restraint. During that same period, Canada's national debt increased by $151 billion. So now that we have a problem with our national debt, where do we turn to start cutting? We start cutting at the people who, in fact, have been the most responsible. I find this a very strange kind of logic, and I also find that it reflects a a particular mindset on the part of government itself. Those of us who have been in executive decision-making positions and sat in boardrooms and listened to discussions about how a company copes with a period of restraint know very well that the first places that many of the accountants and business managers want to start cutting are the creative edges of the corporation.
Right.
They want to cut the research and development budgets. They want to, in a newspaper, for example, they want to tighten down on the amount of news space that's available, because this is a cost factor without a discernible revenue production. In fact, of course, what they're doing is mortgaging the future. Those are probably the last places you should cut.
Where should they cut? Do you have any opinions on where they should start?
Well, yeah, I think one place you could start would be with the government itself, with the cost of government itself. I think that we are...
Jets.
Well,
Concord.
jets flying around, and I mean, I think that one of the things we need to look at is the size of the civil service, the size of the bureaucracy that we have. We need to start asking ourselves how many of the tax dollars that go into that vast infrastructure actually arrive with the people that they're supposed to help. I think we need to begin relying less on government. I'm a real conservative when it comes to government. I believe that government should be smaller, not bigger. I think that we don't need many of the organizational infrastructures that we've created. I think that, in fact, our governments in Canada have been pretty spineless in terms of dealing with these sorts of issues. It's true that you face the prospect of a great deal of dislocation for many, many people if you begin shrinking the size of your public service. But surely, in a creative, productive society, those people can be found places in the private sector that will generate much more productive return to society than they're generating now.
In this connection, I don't know whether you want to tell this, but you've got a very interesting story that you told me off camera before we started the interview about Prince Charles' shoehorn and and the native peoples. Would you mind?
Well, I just thought it was very
Hits the
interesting.
spot.
It was a little paragraph that I clipped out of one of the names columns in the Sun one day about how Prince Charles had been traveling across Canada on his recent tour and lost his favorite shoehorn, which had been left behind in Winnipeg. When this was discovered, a jet was dispatched, or an aircraft in any event was dispatched to go back and recover his shoehorn. Now, I don't know how many thousands of dollars an hour it takes to fly a jet. My guess is that it's probably $5,000 to $8,000 an hour. That would be my guess. I thought of this jet flying back to Winnipeg to pick up the prince's shoehorn so that he could put his shoes on in more comfort instantly the next morning, flying over some of the most impoverished Indian reserves in Canada, places where people have high alcoholism rates, high teenage suicide rates, and the rest of it. To me, this says something about the whole matter of priorities in terms of the way government functions in this country. We're more worried about appearances than we are about actual lives that are being lost on the ground by people who are in the most powerless positions. And I mean, I was struck by the anecdote in terms of its applicability to the structure of our society.
It's incredible when you stop to think about it, but that's the way it is right now. Stephen, apart from your work with the Sun, you also write. You write poetry. You've published 2 books of poetry.
That's right, yes.
Were they inspired by your travels, say in the Arctic, or what type of poems do you like?
Well, I became very interested in the whole process by which I was internalizing the landscape when I was in the Arctic. The way in which I began my internal landscape, my own inner landscapes, the landscapes of my imagination, were being altered by my exposure to the great elemental forces of this other landscape. And so my first book really dealt with that transition, the transformation of my inner space, if you like, by the outer world. And the second book of poetry continued that process and began exploring those inner landscapes in a lyrical way, and both of them were quite well received and got good reviews, and I'm pleased with them. I was happy with the way they turned out.
Can one obtain them from local bookstores?
I think the first book is now out of print. The second book should be available. The publisher is is a publisher in Ontario, Cormorant Books. And I would assume that it would be available if you ordered it through a bookstore. Yeah.
Great. You've also written a book of essays on Canadian history.
Yes, yes.
Which is your topic, right?
That's correct.
Your thing.
Yeah.
So you're quite knowledgeable in that respect. Now, over the past 20 years, how has Canada changed? Has it changed for the better? We've been talking about environmental situations and just a sort of the large picture.
I think I'm an optimist about Canada. I really am. I think Canada has changed for the better. I think it's a better and more humane society that we live in now than it was 50 years ago or 100 years ago. I think that we are more capable, more aware now of the problems that face us. Unfortunately, as our own self-awareness has grown, our own sense of responsibility has grown, so have some of the problems that confront us. The question of division between Quebec and the rest of Canada, I think, is a very troublesome and difficult problem.
What do you feel in that respect? Do you feel we need Quebec, or you?
I feel that Canada could not exist as a psychological entity without Quebec, because in a way Quebec is what distinguishes us from the Americans.
In that note, how about the saying that we are becoming Americanized? Are we?
Yeah, I think we are becoming Americanized, but I think that the whole world is becoming Americanized. I think that there are distinct differences between Canadians and Americans that continue. I think that those differences are less than we would like to think they are, particularly in English Canada. But no, we're not Americans any more than the British or Europeans or the French or West Germans. I mean, Europe itself is moving towards a different kind of structure in which individual states surrender some degrees of their autonomy and sovereignty in exchange for greater freedoms. In fact, there's quite an interesting book written by Peters, the fellow who wrote In Pursuit of Excellence. He wrote a subsequent book called Thriving on Chaos, in which, if you go back and read this book written 3 or 4 years ago and apply what he is saying about major multinational corporations to what you've just seen happen in Central Europe, you'll see that he wrote a master plan for the collapse of the Russian Empire.
So it's happening here too?
I think it will happen here. I think that what has to happen for big corporations, for government, for organizations like my own organization, The Sun, is that they have to be driven increasingly from the periphery of the organization and less from the center of it. We were talking about the hierarchical pyramid, you know, the idea of the president at the top and working right down to the workers at the bottom. Well, what we have to start doing, as Peters points out in Thriving on Chaos, we have to turn that pyramid upside down. We have to start thinking of the people at the top as working fundamentally to support the people above them.
That's a refreshing way of looking at it, Stephen. And on that note, we're going to have to say goodbye. Our time, unfortunately, is up. And I'd like to thank you again for coming down. And we'll be looking for you in The Sun. Keep up the good work.
Happy to be here.
And good luck to you.
Yep.
And I'd also like to thank the Ferguson Point Tea House for providing this beautiful setting for the interviews. For contact, I'm Gloria Crichton. Please join us again next time.